this month, and then there is one more mystery, unsolved video coming as well. So check out the link down below. Let's go ahead and get right into our case today. So today we will be talking about the disappearance of Michelle Kelly Pulsifer. Michelle was born on March 17th, 1966, which was St. Patrick's Day, and she was born in Huntington Beach, California, to Donna Prentice and Richard Pulsifer. So Donna and Richard had been dating in high school for 3 years. They dated, they were very serious, head over heels with each other. And then Donna ended up pregnant. They're both still in high school. But they decided to get married because that's kind of what people did in the 60s. Richard told ABC News that they wanted to do the right thing, and that was getting married. So, while they are both still in high school, they get married. And then Donna gives birth to a baby boy who they named Richard Jr. Donna ended up dropping out of school to stay home and take care of the baby. Richard stayed in school and worked nights at a restaurant, bussing tables. 3 years later, the couple would have Michelle. So they have this beautiful little family, but the marriage didn't last. They were obviously very young when they got married, and having a family as teenagers just put a lot of pressure on the relationship. So they eventually split, but the divorce was very amicable. Richard paid child support regularly, and while Donna was awarded custody of both children, he saw them on a regular basis, and he was still very much involved in their lives. So soon after the split, Donna began dating a guy named Michael Kent. And Michael was not a great guy. He was known to use drugs. He drank a lot. He had a criminal record and a history of violence against women and children. But Donna was in love with this guy, and soon Donna moved 6-year-old Richard Jr. and 3-year-old Michelle in with her new boyfriend, and then he had a 2-year-old son from a previous relationship. And they're still living in the Huntington Beach, California area at this point. Soon after they moved in together, Michael began physically abusing Donna and Richard Jr. On the 4th of July in 1969, Richard Jr. is sound asleep in his bed. It's the middle of the night, and Michelle comes running into her brother's room. She crawled up on his bed, and she said to him, "Hide me." As soon as she had crawled under the covers in her brother's bed, Donna opened the door, scooped up Michelle, and took her out of the room. Richard Jr., who was still half asleep, turned over and went back to bed. It's their garage. He kept his bike and like some toys in there. But on this particular day, he noticed a box that hadn't been there the day before, and it was covered with blankets. And he kind of slowly started to make his way toward the box. His mother rushes out into the garage and yelled at him and told him he wasn't allowed to go in the garage. And he's like, okay, but what's in that box? And she told him it was a motorcycle seat and that he needed to leave the garage. Then, a few days later, the family packs up and just leaves. They move to Illinois. Richard remembers asking his mom where Michelle was, saying that they couldn't move without Michelle. But Donna told him there wasn't enough room in the car for Michelle. But they did have enough room for their dog and 2 cats. So, Richard Jr. is 6 years old and he obviously doesn't understand what is happening. A few days later, Richard Sr., I'm just gonna call him Rich because it's kind of confusing. He's the child's father. He swings by for a visit because he hasn't seen his kids in a while. But when he knocked on the door, no one answered. So he decided he must have just missed them, and he left. But a few days later, he went back, and again, no one answered. No one seemed to be at home at all. And at this point, Rich has this feeling that something was wrong. So he decides to call one of Donna's friends. He knew this friend from when they had been married and figured she would know what was going on. So he calls her and he's like, where's Donna and the kids? And she's like, Richard, oh my God, I thought you knew. They left. They just woke up one morning and decided to move to Illinois. So they packed everything up and they're gone. So then he asked, where in Illinois do you have an address? And she's like, no, I don't. As it would turn out, they had not left a forwarding address. They hadn't told anyone where exactly in Illinois they were moving to. So he is shocked and furious and worried. All of the emotions. And he has no idea what to do. He needs to track down his children. So he goes to the police station to report his children missing. But the police refused to allow him to file a missing person report because they were with their mother and she had custody, so they weren't missing. Technically, they hadn't been kidnapped. In the meantime, the family had settled and kind of living a seemingly normal life in Illinois, except for one thing, or one person, Michelle. Richard Jr. wasn't even allowed to ask about his sister or mention her name, or he got in big trouble. this was the 60s, and it wasn't easy to track people down without the help of law enforcement. There were no cell phones like with trackers, no social media. It was actually very easy to disappear back then. So for a year, he's doing everything he can think of to try and track down his children, but he can't find them. He can't even find any clues as to why they would have left abruptly. There's just nothing. Then, 1 year later, Donna shows up in California with Richard Jr. And while they are there, Richard Jr. was allowed to talk to his father. And it's unclear if they saw each other or just spoke on the phone. So at this point, it is 1 year after his family just relocated. And Richard Sr. realizes that his 3-year-old daughter, Michelle, hadn't gone with them when they had moved to Illinois. He's furious and heartsick, and he demands to know where his daughter is. And Donna says, quote, "It's really none of your business, Richard," end quote. So he again goes to police, and he's like, "Look, something weird is happening here. My wife just up and left, and I thought she took our children with her. I've had absolutely no contact with them in over a year, and I just found out that she only has my son, and I have no idea where my daughter is." Police again do not allow him to file a persons missing child report. But they do go track down Donna, and they speak to her about Richard's concerns or accusations, and she totally pulls a Lori Vallow, and she's like, "Oh, don't worry, I know where she is. She's safe. My ex-husband is just being silly. Michelle is safe and sound." And then the police are like, "Okay, well, cool." After this, Donna immediately leaves California with Richard Jr., and Richard Sr. would not see his son for 10 more years. In 1980, Richard Sr. gets served with these court papers. They had been filed by Donna, or Donna's lawyer, in order to restart the process of child support. See, when she had just up and left, Richard Sr. hadn't been given a forwarding address, so he couldn't send his child support checks to anyone. But now Donna was requesting that he once again start paying child support. But she was only requesting support for Richard Jr. These documents showed that Donna and Richard Jr. were now living in Wisconsin. Richard Sr. is finally able to find out his ex-wife's location, and like the paperwork had her contact information, so he called her and demanded to know where Michelle was. But again, Donna refuses to tell him where she is. So, for years and years, like back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even the 90s, I think, when people would get divorced, almost always the mothers got custody of the children, and the fathers actually had very little rights. So the judge did end up ordering that Richard Sr. pay child support for Richard Jr., but the payments would be withheld until Donna revealed the location of Michelle. And she never did. Now, for whatever reason, the lawyers involved, the judge, no one thought maybe the little girl's whereabouts should be looked into. So, while Richard Jr. was growing up, like I said, he got in big trouble if he mentioned his sister. And eventually his mom would just completely ignore him if he brought up Michelle. Like silent treatment to her son. So as soon as he turned 18, he moved back to California. And he wanted to go back and have a relationship with his father. But he also wanted to go find answers as to where Michelle was. In his mind, I think he thought she must still be living in California because that's where she had been the last time he saw her. So when he got to California and he realized his father knew nothing, no one had any contact with her, he called his mother and begged her to just tell him what happened. Richard Jr. told NBC News about this conversation, and he said, quote, "And she just flat out said, 'I am not going to tell you.' And I said, 'Well, you know I'm her brother. Don't you think I have the right to know?' And she goes, 'Rich, you know things happened. We didn't have a whole lot of money, and we couldn't keep all three of you. And be grateful I chose you.' And when I asked her, 'Well, is she alive?' she said yes. And then I asked if she still had the last name Pulsifer. And she said yes. And then I said, 'Well, what's it going to take for you to tell me?' And she goes, 'Rich, I am not here to make a deal with you.' And that was pretty much it. That was the whole conversation." End quote. In 2001, Michelle's paternal aunt hired a PI to look into Michelle's disappearance. This private investigator could not find any record of any kind for Michelle after July of 1969. She hadn't been enrolled in school, like no doctor's visits, nothing. She just disappeared. So he handed over what little he had found to the Orange County District Attorney's Office. And 34 years after Richard Sr. had first tried to report his daughter missing, Michelle's abrupt disappearance was being investigated by the California authorities. Donna was still living in Wisconsin when this investigation began, with her third husband, and she was interviewed by police in 2003. According to Donna, there just wasn't enough room in the car for Michelle. Plus, she didn't feel like a long road trip would be ideal for a 3-year-old. So, according to her, they left Michelle with Michael's mother to raise. And once they were settled in Illinois, then they would send for her or go get her and bring her back to Illinois to live with them. So police then went and interviewed people, friends, neighbors, family members who interacted with Michael's mom, Jane Lambert. And not one person ever reported seeing Michelle or any little girl. These people also reported that they didn't think that Jane would even agree to raise Michelle, or have a little girl around. That would have been pretty out of character for her. At this point, Jane was pretty old. Michelle was a toddler. Plus, in 1969, she was suffering from pretty severe alcoholism, and she had just been diagnosed with breast cancer. So Jane died in 1972, so police couldn't speak to her. Donna told police that Michael didn't want Michelle to come to Illinois with them, and she was too scared of him to try and look for her daughter or try to ever reunite with her. She said Michael had a very violent temper and he often threatened to kill her. So after looking into Michelle's disappearance for about a year, she was the one who allegedly found her daughter dead. They both pled not guilty to the murder charges. Michael agreed to testify against Donna, but then he died before Donna's trial began. He had been in bad health for a while, and the 6 months that he spent in jail, I guess his health just declined very quickly. He suffered from diabetes, internal bleeding, and kidney problems. Donna went to trial in 2007, and all through her trial, she denied having anything to do with her daughter's disappearance. Then the jury was unable to reach a verdict, so a mistrial was declared. Again, in 2008, a jury was unable to reach a verdict, and the judge in the case dismissed the charges against Donna, saying there wasn't enough evidence to take this case to trial for a third time. Donna went free after being held in jail for 4 years, awaiting her trial, or her trials. Richard Sr. and his wife Kathy drove from Las Vegas, where they lived, to Orange County for every single trial. He never stopped searching for his daughter. If Michelle Kelly Pulsifer is alive, she is now 56 years old. I just quickly want to cite my sources for this video. After all, these reporters kind of do all of the heavy lifting, and I just kind of regurgitate the information. I got information from an abcnews.com article titled "Little Girl in the Blue Dress," which was published on August 3rd, 2010, and it was written by John Larson. I also got information from the Charlie Project and a medium.com article by Kat Lee titled "Missing Person Report Filed 34 Years After Young Child Vanishes." That was published on November 12th, 2021. Also an LA Times article by Claire Luna from October 15th, 2004, titled "Pair Plead Not Guilty in OC Girl's 1969 Disappearance." Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. This case reminds me so much of the Lori Vallow case. We have a crappy mother who finds a new boyfriend, and in the Lori Vallow case, it's still unfolding. We don't know everything that happened, but they begin moving around a lot, and people just kind of assume their children are with them, but actually their children are dead. And her and her new boyfriend just go on living lives. They take this trip to Hawaii, they get married, and then someone, I think a grandparent, finally raises the alarm, and they realize that no one has seen the kids. And luckily, even though those grandparents did not have custody of JJ, police still started to look into it, and they are both currently behind bars awaiting their charges. It's just so sad. Like, your parents should be the safest people for you to be around. Your parents are the ones who should keep you safe. In this case, I really wish we knew what had happened on that 4th of July, because I think something happened that night, and there was a reason that Michelle went running into her brother's bedroom in the middle of the night and begged him to hide her. Like, that is heartbreaking. This is one of these cases where we may never know. It's been so long. A lot of the people involved are now dead. It's so frustrating that this father was not allowed to report his daughter missing. Even if the mom had custody, in what world is it okay for a parent to just take their children away from another parent? I believe that if he had been able to file that report and police would have just looked into where she was, they may have been able to recover her body, and both Michael and Nana would have been sent to prison where they obviously belong. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. I love you all. Have a great week, and I'll be back soon.